So, to kick things off, I thought it'd be worth just discussing a little bit about why we're here. So, it shouldn't be too much of a surprise to anyone in this room that ransomware is a real problem at the moment. It's not a new or emerging threat. It's been around for a while. And in the last year alone, we've seen a large number of quite significant breaches with some pretty huge payouts. I actually saw a statistic the other day on Twitter, of all places, from, I believe, the US Treasury, linking something like $5 billion in Bitcoin transactions specifically to ransomware. Now, that's not me trying to scare you. It's just making, hopefully, everyone aware that ransomware is a real problem and it's something we need to address. Now, this talk isn't about any specific ransomware-based threat actor. I could give that talk, but it would be based on online information, public information that you could find out yourselves. I thought it'd be much better to give you an idea of how you would actually assess your organization's ability to prevent, detect, and respond to ransomware-based threat actors. Now, before we start, I want to ask a bit of a rhetorical question, so please don't answer. If I asked you right now, how would you assess your resilience to ransomware-based threat actors? How would you go about it? Okay, what would an engagement of that nature look like? And what are some of the concerns you'd have to address before performing it? Now, for this talk, I thought I'd give a bit of a story. Okay, so what we're going to do is run through an example of an engagement that we performed for a number of our clients based on sort of ransomware emulation. Now, as Ryan mentioned, our clients are anonymous. We can't talk about the actual engagements that we perform. So what I was going to do is talk about this company, Unhackable Finances, which is a financial services client. Everything in this talk is based on our actual experiences performing these engagements. In the last year alone, we've seen a marked increase in the number of our clients who are coming to us and saying, look, we can see ransomware is becoming a real problem. We really want to identify what gaps we have in our detection and response capabilities. And this is exactly what happened with Unhackable Finances. And our story starts with Bob. This is Bob. Bob is the deputy head of security for Unhackable Finances. And as you can see, Bob looks pretty miserable. He's knackered, he's got his coffee, but it's not really helping. And that's because Bob's just got off the phone to his boss, who's grilled him for, let's say, 4 hours, all about ransomware. Can we detect our evil corp, pretty much any APT with evil in the name? And unfortunately, Bob hasn't got the answers. He can't definitively say where they can prevent, detect, or respond to these specific threat actors. And we're talking about very specific threat actors. Now, off the back of that call, Bob calls me up. He gives me a ring and he says, look, Tim, I'm in a bit of a pickle here. I've just been grilled for like 4 hours by my boss, and I can't tell him definitively where we're able to address these ransomware-based attacks. So off the back of that call with Bob, we do what we always do in our engagements, and we start sort of the pre-delivery phase of any engagement. This is hopefully a process many of you will be familiar with, just off the back of doing any engagement with us. And as always, this starts with scoping. Now, scoping is not necessarily the most interesting topic, but there are a few interesting quirks that are specific to ransomware-based engagements. So as always, we start by identifying the objectives, so typically assessing their ability to detect, prevent, and respond to an attack by specific threat actors. As I said, things people like R-Evil and Evil Corp and Conti and all sorts. We also have to define things like the rules of engagement. And for an engagement of this nature, it's really important to make sure it's as collaborative as possible. There's really no point trying to slip under the radar of the SOC, okay? They should be involved in the entire process. It's the best way to get the most value out of an engagement like this. And then one of the more interesting things I noticed with Unhackable Finances, and actually the majority of clients I've done work like this for, was this need to actually sell it to the business. And I don't mean justifying cost. I'm not saying people coming back to us and saying, well, it shouldn't be that much, you can make it cheaper. I mean actually justifying allowing us to perform an engagement of that nature. And really, this is about calming people's nerves. So what ended up happening is during the scoping call, I'd said to Bob, and this is a mistake really on my part, I said, look, Bob, we're going to need a couple of servers. We're definitely going to need a couple of user endpoints, so laptops or virtual desktop infrastructure. And what we're going to do is detonate ransomware on those systems. Now, in hindsight, I probably shouldn't have said that, because Bob took those words verbatim and started submitting change requests to his IT team. And those change requests said stuff like, oh, I've got these guys F-Secure coming in, can I get a couple of laptops provisioned so they can just detonate ransomware? As you can imagine, that raised a few eyebrows. People weren't too happy with that. Now, at first, I thought, OK, this is going to be a problem. If we can't even get sign-off to perform an engagement of this nature, we're just never going to be able to do it. And one of the things we tried, just almost as a bit of potluck, was just to remove the word ransomware entirely. And we started using phrases like benignware, because ultimately that's what it was. And as soon as we did that, interestingly enough, no one really had too many concerns at that point. So Bob deletes the change requests, creates new ones, and they just say F-Secure are looking to execute some benignware. And it was really surprising how well that worked and how much that addressed people's concerns. Now, once we've got the scope together and sign off, we start with the first phase of the actual assessment. Now, normally, for a typical assessment, so a NetSec assessment or an AppSec assessment, once the engagement starts, we're on site, we're doing our active testing. That's not quite the case with this specific example. Because we're looking to identify their resilience to specific threat actors, we actually have to identify the TTPs those attackers make use of before we can generate our list of test cases. Okay? And this is a three-step process. So what we do during this research phase is identify the TTPs of those specific threat actors across the whole attack lifecycle, across the whole kill chain. Once we've done that, we'll abstract away all of the noise. So something I certainly found when I was doing engagements of this nature is a lot of the tactics and techniques these attackers use will just have garbage associated with them. An initial access vector, for example, might drop 5 or 6 files to disk. It might launch 3 or 4 different processes, all in some weird effort to masquerade the actual execution or the actual objective they're trying to achieve. Now, once we've abstracted away all that noise, we then look to emulate the TTP itself. And this is where we develop our own code that will allow us to perform some form of test case that will assess Unhackable Finance's ability to detect that technique or prevent it and help them develop or elevate their detection use cases. Now, it's a bit high level, that, so I thought we'd walk through a relatively simple example of a test case that we executed against Unhackable Finances. So what we're looking at here is the initial access vector for Wasted Locker, which is one of the ransomwares for Evil Corp. What we see here in the top left with that little Chrome icon is the initial download. So the victim user downloads a zip file. That zip file, if extracted, will drop a JavaScript file to disk. So in this instance, chrome.update.js. If that's executed, it will drop another file to disk, which then launches WScript to perform some reconnaissance, followed by PowerShell to download and inject an implant from a remote host. Now, what we're going to do is abstract and then emulate. We're going to follow the three-step process I mentioned. And hopefully, one of the things you should be able to see here is that if we were to build a detection use case for every step in this TTP, in this tactic, it could be quite brittle. Any variance in that initial access vector will likely break the detection that you've built. And what we really want to focus on is the latter stages of that technique. So we'll start by performing our first layer of abstraction. And it's quite simple, right? All we're doing is getting rid of the second JavaScript file to disk, because we don't really care too much that that has been dropped, okay? We're really focusing on the initial access and the end execution. Now, abstraction can be performed in multiple iterations. So we can abstract again, and end up with what we really care about, which is the sort of suspicious launching of W scripts, and then finally the actual PowerShell download and inject cradle. Finally, once we've abstracted away, we can then emulate. Now, I'm not necessarily expecting anyone to really understand what this code is doing. What I'm trying to get across here is that this isn't a real effort. This alone would have taken maybe half a day to write and test. All we have here is some VB script that will perform some initial reconnaissance, so the net user, who am I, and net group commands, followed by the PowerShell execution to download and inject an implant from a remote host. So this is quite simple, and we do this for as many TTPs as we can, so we can generate the test cases that we want to run during the active phase of testing. Now, at this stage, let's say we've got all our test cases ready, so I get back on the phone to Bob, and I'm like, look, I've got these test cases, it would be worth having a quick call, reviewing them, making sure that we've got the coverage we need, and get any input from yourself. Now, at this point, we meet Bill. This is Bill. Bill is the head of risk management at Unhackable Finances. And Bill is, again, looking relatively stressed. I'm not making too many friends at this company. And that's because Bill's got wind of this engagement, and as the head of risk management, he's got some concerns, but they are valid concerns. So off the back of Bill's concerns, we do what we always do for being consultants, and we have another meeting. So I get Bob and Bill together in a room, and we start talking about risk management, everyone's favorite topic. Now, the idea here is to try and get that balance between addressing Bill's concerns and meeting his appetite for risk with the actual coverage of the assessment. We could be really risk averse. I could get rid of all of the risk associated with this assessment by not performing a single test case. But then we would get no coverage of their ability to detect and respond to these sorts of attacks. Now, Bill's main concern was around the prevention of unintended execution. So during this meeting, Bill was sort of, I'm a little bit concerned that some of our maybe overzealous or overly curious IT admins and SOC analysts might take some of your samples and just start playing with them in their own environments or within our environment. And the issue there is if they accidentally detonate, say, one of our benignware samples, then they might encrypt something that we never intended to test. Once we'd sort of identified Bill's risk appetite, we had to identify all of the test cases that crossed that line. Okay, so everything that he was not happy with us performing. And this was typically around their key systems and the encryption of their key systems, such as their Swift payment network, their CRM platforms. And to be fair, this is all the sort of stuff that we also weren't particularly keen on testing, regardless of whether it was in prod or dev. I didn't want angry devs turning up at my door, wondering why they couldn't use their dev environment anymore. Now, to address the specific concern around unintended execution, we make use of what we'd call guardrails. Now, guardrails for me, as a red teamer, are typically used to prevent a SOC from analyzing our payloads. In this instance, what we're actually looking to do is to prevent the payload from being executed, or the test case from being executed, in an environment that we don't intend it to. It's really, really simple. What we've got here in this sort of, as I said, quite simple diagram, is two sort of end states. We've got our execute box, the green box in the top right, and then we've got our terminate box in the bottom there. And then we have a set of conditions which are in the diamonds. And this really just comes down to a set of if statements, if you will, some checks. So all we're doing here is, if we get to the execute box, we want to check that the date is correct. We're going to check that the Active Directory domain is correct and that the host name is correct. We're also going to check that the folder is also correct. If and only if all of those conditions are true, will that test case execute. If any one of them is false, then it will just terminate and nothing will happen. And again, this is a really simple example and could be made infinitely more complex with all sorts of different checks. User interaction, for example, giving it a certain password or string, all sorts of different things you can do that can be considered guardrails to prevent unintended execution. Now, once we sort of redeveloped some of our test cases, got on the phone to Bill again. We showed him some of these test cases and demonstrated how we're going to manage that risk, his specific concerns. Once we've done that, we get sign-off, everyone's a bit happier again, and we move into actually delivering the engagement. Now, this is all, for this first phase of delivery, it's all about executing our test cases. And this is quite a simple process, and it's cyclical. So what we do is we start by executing the test case itself. We'll then analyze the results. And what I mean by that is we'll jump into a call with the SOC, or we'll get on our message platforms, so like Teams or Zoom, and we'll say, look, we've just executed the initial access vector for Wasted Locker. Can you show us your EDR dashboards, your detection, any alerts, any telemetry? And what we're looking to do there is, A, identify if they were able to detect or prevent that test case, but mainly see if there's any bypasses or gaps within their monitoring and alerting. If there are, then what we'll do is redevelop that test case with those specific bypasses in mind. At that stage, we'll then simply re-execute the test case. Okay, so relatively simple idea. I thought we'd walk through just an easy enough example, going back to the Wasted Locker initial access vector. So we have 3 test cases here, and we start with the very top one. You might note that we have kept the Chrome.update JavaScript file, and this was mainly because we have the opportunity to also test various file formats that can facilitate initial access, for example, JavaScript. And we wanted to get assurances around that. Now, in the first test case, as you can see, we start by executing the JS or the JavaScript file, and it's blocked. And this is because the jscripts.exe process is prohibited from launching on their user workstations. Now, hopefully, it should be quite obvious that that test case can't just end there. You gain really no understanding as to your detection and response if you just stop at that test case and say, well, Wasted Locker would never get to PowerShell or WScript within their initial access vector, so we're just going to assume that that is fine. We can prevent that entire chain. It's just not true. So what we do is we look for some bypasses, and we found that HTAs, or HTML applications, were allowed to run on the end-user devices. So we simply redeveloped the test case, and in this instance, moving from the JavaScript to the HTAs is actually quite simple. And then we re-execute it. In this instance, what we see is the HTA launches, Chrome.update.hta launches successfully, allowing for MSHTA to then launch PowerShell. Once that PowerShell download and inject cradle executes, we actually see that that's then prevented. And what actually happened here is their endpoint detection and response successfully identified the malicious PowerShell process and the implant attempt at being injected. And that gives you a much better assurance around your detection and response for this specific test case, as opposed to simply the first test case. Now, although that was prevented, we do still want an implant running on their end-user system. And this is because there are a number of test cases that rely on some form of, say, C2 channel that we can execute through, for example, lateral movement. And that's what we do with the final test case. It's slightly less realistic. I mean, it's very unrealistic, in my opinion, that a user would simply download an executable and run it. But it could happen. So it's, like I said, slightly less realistic, but allows us to progress with the engagement. Now, this is a very simple example, but we do this for all of our test cases, and we follow a similar pattern. And once we run through those test cases, we then move on to the objectives. And this is where I'll introduce Sharon, another person who's not too happy with me being at Unhackable Finances. Sharon is one of the IT admins at Unhackable Finances, and one of her specific responsibilities is around the backup solutions that they have. So Sharon's looking a little bit frustrated, and that's because she's currently reading an email all about F-Secure wanting to test their ability to recover from ransomware attacks, so ransomware executing on various systems in their environment. So we do, again, what we like to do in consultancy, and we have another meeting. And now I've got a bit of a dream team going on here. So I've got Bill, who's being head of risk management, is with us throughout the engagement now. We've also got Bob, who obviously is part of the engagement itself, and Sharon as well. And what we're doing here is trying to gain an understanding of how we can execute our ransomware test cases, the actual encryption of their systems, in the best way possible. Now, Sharon and Bill, actually, in this instance, were quite happy with us to deploy ransomware on their client systems. So Sharon was like, yeah, take a couple of laptops, detonate your ransomware on there, just see what happens, I'm almost quoting word for word there. At that point, Bill did step in and was like, okay, we do need to make sure that any mapped drives, for example, don't get encrypted, because you don't want to start encrypting random file shares within the internal network. We did a similar thing for the server estate. They spun up a couple of servers, and again, we sort of detonated our ransomware, and it was actually quite fun to see what happened, to be quite fair. That was a really important test to perform. It was the first time Unhackable Finances had ever actually performed a recovery of a completely trashed system. It's not necessarily about having some fancy screen that says you've been ransomwared. It's all about the actual recovery, testing that your backups actually work. Now, once we'd done the client estate and some of the servers, we then move on to some of the more critical systems. Now, no one in this meeting, and myself included, were too keen on performing ransomware against, say, their Swift payment network or their CRM platforms or anything of that nature, regardless of it being, as I said, in prod or dev or shadow prod. It's just the level of risk there is just too high. So at this stage, we have tabletop exercises. Now, what this basically means is we got the subject matter experts for each of these key systems or critical functions, and we had a meeting where we essentially just said to them, look, F-Secure want to just run some things by you. They want to see how an attack, they want to show you how an attack would progress from these specific threat actors, and whether you think you'd be able to recover from those. What would the impact be? You know, what is the impact of our Swift payment network going down? I can imagine it's not going to be very good. One of the big points for these tabletop exercises was to make sure that those SMEs didn't feel like they were being assessed. We tried to gamify the whole thing. So at the moment they feel like they're under assessment, it becomes much more defensive. You know, we'd say things like, okay, what if they compromised SCCM? And they deployed ransomware through there? And you know, the SMEs, if they were being defensive, would sort of be like, well, no, that's never going to happen. Don't worry about it. It's all about that collaborative engagement with the various personnel who are responsible for all of this sort of stuff. So we do that. We do the tabletop exercises, and they went really well. And at this stage, we've covered all of the test cases we want, and we've assessed their ability to recover from ransomware attacks. And we then move into the last phase of testing, which I'm going to call the closure phase. And what actually happens here is we take all of the test cases that we've performed, we take all of the results, and for each test case that wasn't prevented or detected, we get together with the blue team, so the offensive guys, myself and my teammates, get together with the SOC, and we actually help them build out new detection use cases specific to the test cases that we ran. So really simple example here, going back to the wasted locker initial access attempt, is a detection in Defender for Endpoint, or ATP, that simply checks for suspicious use of net and whoami.exe launching as a child of MSHTA. And this would be the variation from JavaScript to HTA. And again, this is a very simple example. You might be thinking, okay, why didn't you do this as part of the test case cycle? Why wasn't this one of the phases? And that's simply because in our experience of performing these assessments, there's too many test cases to get through. And it's much better that you execute the test cases themselves and have those results so that you can later build out your detection use cases. Obviously, I'd love to spend 5 or 6 weeks just doing this, but but it's not possible. There's never really the budget to do just that. And it's worth noting as well that with the results, there's no reason the SOC guys and girls can't come back to us after the engagement and have us help them. So what happened in this instance was I would get emails every other week from the SOC saying, oh, hey, Tim, it's me again. Here's a new rule that we've written, and we'd like to determine whether does this make sense? Do you think this would give adequate detection and alerts? And that goes on for a while. So once we've done the detection use cases, we sort of come to the very end of the engagement. We hand off our report to Bob, which says, gives him a definitive answer as to his organization's ability to detect and respond to attacks from specific threat actors, the threat actors that his boss was asking about. So once we hand off that report, this is what Bob looks like. He's happy, and he's chilling out. I think he's got a bit of a tan all of a sudden. He's actually a completely different bloke. And that's because Bob can go back to his boss and answer all of those questions. Okay, he's got a report that gives him evidence that says we can detect our evil at these stages in their attack life cycle. Here's some of the results of our recovery processes and some of the gaps that we identified. Here's maybe where we need to start focusing some more budget towards to elevate some of our defensive capabilities. So like I said, Bill's pretty happy. And one of the other benefits of this engagement is that if Bob, that's my bad. If Bob goes back to his boss and his boss starts asking him about new threat actors, he's got that reference experience. He knows what an engagement of this nature would look like, and his SOC would be ready to perform a similar engagement. So I did give you that sort of rhetorical question at the start of this presentation. I asked you, if I was to ask you, what would a ransomware emulation engagement look like? How would you perform that in your specific organizations? I'm hoping that 25, 30 minutes later, I've helped give you a good idea as to how you might answer that.